Everyone in Prince Yang's mansion knew that Lu Xian did not love his princess consort. The reason was simple. This marriage was never of his own choosing. That year, Lu Xian was assigned to oversee the Qiantang River embankment, which collapsed under a thaw flood, destroying thousands of homes and ruining acres of fertile land. After an investigation by the imperial censor, it was found that corruption among the officials and poor quality materials were to blame. The public outcry was overwhelming, and the emperor, in a fit of rage, ordered Prince Xiang to be imprisoned. Lu Xian had a beloved woman, Zhuang Yingxue, the cherished daughter of the Minister of Revenue. They had grown up together, deeply in love. However, no sooner had Lu Xian fallen from grace than Zhuang Yingxue was married off to Prince Gong Lui. Later, it was Chancellor Du, a man with vast influence over the court, who secured Lu Xian's release. The only condition Du set was that Lu Xian must marry his only daughter, Du Qinghuan. Lu Xian was released in the dead of winter. The sky over the imperial capital was gloomy, and large snowflakes drifted down. Du Qinghuan, wrapped in a light-colored cloak embroidered with begonias and holding a sky-blue oil paper umbrella, stood outside the prison with her father, waiting to welcome Lu Xian. The months in prison had left Lu Xian with a touch of weariness in his brows, but it did not diminish his extraordinary, otherworldly good looks. Dressed in flowing white robes, he walked towards them through the vast expanse of snow. Upon seeing Chancellor Du, a faint, mocking smile curled on his lips. In the depth of winter, how could I trouble the Chancellor to come and greet me personally? Chancellor Du bowed slightly. Your Highness, there's no need for such formality. We will soon be family, after all. It is only right that I put in some extra effort. The seemingly plain words carried an arrogant declaration of the path that lay ahead for Lu Xian. As he spoke, Chancellor Du, noting the growing darkness in Lu Xian's expression, introduced, Your Highness, this is my daughter, Qinghuan. This was the first time Lu Xian laid eyes on Du Qinghuan, and he couldn't help but be slightly taken aback. He had long heard of the Du family's daughter, famed throughout the capital for her beauty and talent, like a fairy descended to earth. But he had never expected her to be this beautiful. Upon hearing her father's words, Du Qinghuan curtsied respectfully. Greetings, Your Highness. Lu Xian silently observed her, scrutinizing her carefully for a moment. It was brief, but it was enough for the calculating Chancellor Du to discern something, and he nodded in satisfaction. Everyone knew that Prince Yang was proud and unruly, with grand ambitions. To make him willingly accept this marriage, it would take some effort. That was why Chancellor Du decided to bring Du Qinghuan out on this bitterly cold and stormy day. Sure enough, the resistance in Lu Xian's eyes faded slightly, replaced by a glimmer of something else. Chancellor Du believed that this was a sign that Lu Xian was pleased with his daughter's appearance. But Du Qinghuan felt an inexplicable sense of foreboding, suspecting that this glimmer might represent something far more ominous, a thrill at the thought of gradually tormenting and destroying something so beautiful. A few months later, with Chancellor Du's covert assistance, Lu Xian regained the emperor's favor and, as promised, requested the emperor's permission to marry. The emperor granted his wish. On the night of their grand wedding, Lu Xian, feeling resentful over being coerced, drank heavily. He came to the back garden, drunk and alone. Out of nowhere, a figure leapt from behind the rockery and into his arms. It was his beloved, Zhuang Yingxue. Bathed in the soft moonlight, the beauty buried herself in his embrace, weeping as if the falling pear blossoms were rain. She told Lu Xian that after he was imprisoned, Chancellor Du had suddenly pressured her father, Minister Zhuang, and that Lu Yi had always coveted her beauty. Seizing the opportunity, Lu Yi forced her into marriage. In hindsight, it seemed that Chancellor Du had orchestrated all this, paving the way for Du Qinghuan to become Prince Xiang's consort. Lu Xian gritted his teeth in hatred, his eyes filled with a ruthless, venomous gleam. He held Zhuang Yingxue tightly, as if he could merge his beloved into his very bones. Not far away, in the pavilion draped with red silk and lit by the light of wedding candles, Du Qinghuan, who had seen it all, quietly lowered the window. Du Qinghuan didn't inform her father about what she had witnessed, but Prince Xiang's mansion was filled with Chancellor Du's spies. Within just 6 months, Minister Zhuang was convicted and exiled, and Lu Yi was found guilty of bribing officials to cause the Qiantang River breach and frame Lu Xian. As a result, Lu Yi was stripped of his title and placed under house arrest. In the blink of an eye, Zhuang Yingshua's life was turned upside down. She cried as she rushed into Prince Xiang's mansion, begging Lu Xian to save her father. It was early morning, still chilly in the spring air. Du Qinghuan sat quietly before her dressing table, watching through the bronze mirror as her husband tenderly embraced another woman, his expression full of affection and warmth, so different from the rough treatment he had given her the night before. Lu Xian comforted Zhuang Yingxue and promised to plead for her father's life. But when he returned from court, Zhuang Yingxue was already cold and lifeless. Du Qinghuan knew it was her father who had acted. He could not tolerate any threat to his daughter's position as the legitimate consort. That night, the wind howled through the courtyard as Lu Xian sat alone, drinking. A few petals of a begonia flower fell onto his shoulder, his silhouette desolate and sorrowful. Sometimes, Du Qinghuan envied Zhuang Yingxue because she had become a forever unattainable memory in Lu Xian's heart, creating an unbridgeable chasm between him and Du Qinghuan. She thought Lu Xian not only disliked her, but probably harbored some resentment as well. So no matter how he indulged in revelry or lingered in brothels, she didn't feel that he had wronged her. After their marriage, Du Qinghuan's life was neither particularly good nor bad, and Chancellor Du didn't mind Lu Xian's debauchery. After all, he never expected Du Qinghuan to win Lu Xian's heart. Their alliance was always one of mutual exploitation. Chancellor Du didn't care for Lu Xian's affection for his daughter. What he sought was the future title of imperial consort's father and the immense power that title would bring. Lu Xian, on his part, wasn't afraid that his romantic escapades would anger Chancellor Du after all. When Chancellor Du chose to save him back then, wasn't it precisely because he had no powerful maternal family? Among the emperor's many sons, most were either incompetent or had powerful maternal families. After much consideration, only Lu Xian was a suitable choice. And so, they reached a delicate balance, with Du Qinghuan surviving in the cracks of this arrangement. No one cared about the feelings of a mere pawn. Du Qinghuan didn't harbor any resentment. She had long understood that with her illustrious family name came an inescapable fate. She lived quietly, diligently managing everything in the mansion, gently advising Lu Xian to drink less and sleep early. She was proper and composed, but whether Lu Xian listened or acted on her advice was his choice. Occasionally, when Lu Xian threw a tantrum, Du Qinghuan accepted it all, even though she often felt a deep sense of grievance and sorrow. She never allowed herself to act spoiled or angry. Sometimes, she wondered if her behavior was simply fulfilling her duty as a princess, or if there was a trace of genuine feeling involved. Lu Xian had probably forgotten that they had actually met when they were very young. As a child, Du Qinghuan was frail and often stayed with her grandfather in the warm and humid climate of Jiangnan to recover. That year, her father's political enemies discovered her whereabouts and sent vicious bandits to kidnap her. Du Qinghuan was tied up, stuffed into a sack, and thrown onto a carriage. It was then that Lu Xian appeared. At that time, the emperor had sent his sons to different regions for training. Lu Xian, on a whim, had left his attendants behind and ventured into the bustling night market alone, where he unexpectedly encountered the kidnapping. Without hesitation, Lu Xian single-handedly took on the bandits. Du Qinghuan, bound and trembling inside the sealed sack, could hear the relentless clash of weapons. After a prolonged fight, the world suddenly went quiet. Then, someone lightly jumped onto the carriage, untied the ropes, and revealed her disheveled hair from inside the sack. Tearfully, Du Qinghuan looked up to see the face of a handsome young man. He was wounded, his fair face stained with blood. Upon seeing that she was unharmed, he let out a long sigh of relief and comforted her, saying, "Don't be afraid, miss. I'll take you home." In the dark night, with the wind howling and the moon hidden, his gentle smile was like an eternal star. At that time, they were strangers, but Lucien had unhesitatingly come to her rescue, his youthful righteousness shining through. Because of this past incident, Du Qinghuan often remembered him fondly. She believed that deep down, Lucien's soul was kind. Later, when Du Qinghuan returned to the capital, she saw Lucien from afar a few times at court banquets. She was surprised to realize that the sixth prince was the same young man who had saved her, and after that, she couldn't help but pay more attention to him. She knew everything about Lucien. He was so outstanding, sharp in criticizing the government, and carefree in his calligraphy. Even though he already had a confidant, over time, a seed unknowingly planted in Du Qinghuan's heart quietly sprouted and grew. If it weren't for the grand court meeting held every 3 years, which brought many foreign men and women to the capital, Du Qinghuan would almost have forgotten that she and Lucien had been married for 3 years. Now, Lucien's influence had grown, and the situation in the capital was increasingly tense. Over the years, Du Qinghuan had managed the inner household with meticulous care, quickly uncovering a traitor secretly sending messages outside. Many of the servants in the prince's residence worked there with their entire families, so she implemented collective punishment, administering 30 lashes to each guilty person and making everyone in the household watch as a warning. That day, the courtyard echoed with the sounds of miserable screams. When Lucien returned and heard about the incident, he felt a storm brewing in his chest. Entering Du Qinghuan's room, he sneered and spat out, "The princess is truly skilled. You and your father have spared no effort in helping me achieve my great ambitions." Seeing that he was determined to twist her actions, Du Qinghuan lost the desire to argue. Instead, she respectfully bowed and said, "Your Highness is too kind. This is merely my duty." Her manners were impeccable, her behavior proper and composed, leaving no room for criticism. Yet, this was precisely what Lucien despised. Everyone in the capital said that Chancellor Du's daughter was a treasure, renowned for her virtue and beauty. Lucien was determined to destroy her perfection as a silent challenge to Chancellor Du. But Du Qinghuan remained calm and unruffled, which only infuriated Lucien further. He slammed the door and left, not returning for half a month until the emperor's decree arrived at the mansion, prompting his belated return. The decree ordered Prince Yang to lead an army of 100,000 to suppress a rebellion in the north. Everyone knew this was both an opportunity and a test from the emperor, the final assessment before Lucien could be crowned crown prince. Before Lucien's departure, Du Qinghuan felt inexplicably anxious, so she visited Xinghua Temple and obtained a talisman for his safety, carefully sewing it into the lining of his armor. She didn't tell him about it. The small red talisman was a secret, just like her feelings for him, silent and unnoticed. Lucien was gone for a year, facing countless dangers and battles, with rivers of blood and narrow escapes. Du Qinghuan, living quietly in the capital, was constantly bombarded with news, worrying for him day and night, unable to sleep. Finally, the Qin army triumphed, and Lucien returned victorious. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still damp. The midsummer wind was starting to blow, bringing with it a stifling heat. Du Qinghuan had been waiting at the prince's residence gate early, ready to welcome Lucien home after his audience with the emperor. Shortly after dawn, she heard the sound of approaching hooves, accompanied by the clear and pleasant laughter of a woman. After the trials of the battlefield, Lucien was even more confident and spirited. He reached out to help a woman in red dismount, leading her into the residence. When Du Qinghuan greeted him, he only gave a slight nod without even looking at her. The woman, Zhao Wan, was the daughter of General Zhao, who had long been stationed in the northern military camps and had played a crucial role in quelling the rebellion. Zhao Wan was bold and unrestrained, a perfect match for Lucien. With her seductive beauty, she easily ignited a man's desire to conquer. In the male-dominated environment of the military camps, it was obvious how she and Lucien had become entangled. Now, Lucien openly brought her into the residence, making no attempt to hide their relationship. If it weren't for Chancellor Du's influence, Zhao Wan would likely have already been married into the mansion as a concubine. Because of this, Zhao Wan, still without a formal title, resented Du Qinghuan deeply. She roamed freely in the residence, openly flirting with Lu Xian, completely disregarding Du Qinghuan. One day, Lu Xian took Zhao Wan to the outskirts of the city to ride horses and admire the flowers. Before they left, Du Qinghuan cautioned, "Your Highness, the air is heavy today, and there may be a storm. It's best to take a raincoat with you." Before Lu Xian could respond, Zhao Wan decisively refused, saying, "The sun is so bright right now, how could there be rain? Let's go. Your Highness, don't listen to this killjoy." Lu Xian, with a playful indulgence in his eyes, smiled and said, "I'll listen to you." Du Qinghuan suddenly felt a pang of discomfort, her heart cold and sour. She felt it not just for Zhuang Yingxue, who had likely long been forgotten by Lu Xian, but also for herself, who had never managed to enter his heart. Her temperament was too gentle and mild, plain and flavorless, while he was like an eagle soaring in the sky, and Zhao Wan was the perfect companion to fly alongside him. It was she who couldn't keep up with his dreams. It was she who didn't deserve his brightness. The turning point came in late autumn of that year. The emperor, plagued by a lingering illness that no medicine could cure, finally succumbed. On the very night that the decree to appoint Lu Xian as the crown prince arrived at Prince Xiang's residence, several imperial princes conspired to launch a coup. That harrowing night was destined to be drenched in blood and strewn with corpses. Zhao Wan and her father became Lu Xian's greatest allies, and after a night of deadly combat, the rebellion was finally crushed. Lu Xian ascended to the throne, following the late emperor's edict, and took the reign named Jiyuan. That same year, he made Du Qinghuan his empress and bestowed the title of noble consort upon Zhao Wan. Life in the palace remained much the same as before. Du Qinghuan continued her quiet and peaceful existence, and Lu Xian still did not care for her. The only difference was that Lu Xian hardly ever visited her chambers anymore. Even on the 15th of each month, when it was customary for the emperor and empress to share a bed, he would only lie down beside her, making no further moves. It was clear that Lu Xian did not want Du Qinghuan to bear his child. At that time, the court was still dominated by the Du family, and if Du Qinghuan were to give birth to a son, it would not be a favorable outcome for the Lu dynasty. Lu Xian began to cultivate his own power. He had never been a mere puppet. He possessed extraordinary talent in governance. This was the most puzzling aspect for Du Qinghuan. Lu Xian was no obedient pawn, yet her father had chosen him to fulfill his ambitions. Perhaps before he ascended the throne, Lu Xian had been compelled by circumstances to ally with Chancellor Du, but now, as Emperor Jiyuan, he was like a lion ready to pounce, his sharp claws already bared. Her father must have had a backup plan, Du Qinghuan thought. In just 4 short years, Lu Xian had nurtured a group of officials who now stood in opposition to the chancellor's faction. That year, the winter was especially harsh, with snow blanketing the entire capital. Du Qinghuan's old illness flared up, confining her to bed with no signs of improvement. Since Chancellor Du had become the emperor's father-in-law, the Du family's status had only grown more illustrious, and with it came an increasing arrogance in their behavior. In the 12th lunar month, Du Qinghuan's brother was imprisoned for a crime, and the impeachment letters from officials piled up in the emperor's study like snowflakes, leaving even Chancellor Du momentarily at a loss. Du Qinghuan was exceptionally intelligent. Even setting aside her brother's usual caution, the speed at which the officials submitted their memorials was suspiciously swift. It was all orchestrated by Lu Xian. Realizing this, Du Qinghuan was filled with dread as she dragged her frail body to the emperor's chambers. Dusk was falling, the wind howled, and snowflakes swirled through the air. The lights in the 1,000 palaces were lit one by one. Du Qinghuan, not even brushing off the snow on her shoulders, knelt before the emperor's desk, her forehead touching the ground. At that moment, Lu Xian was cradling Zhao Wan in his arms, guiding her hand as she painted a landscape. Without even looking up, he responded to Du Qinghuan's plea for her brother, saying indifferently, "Since the empress is ill, you should rest well. From now on, let Wanwan handle the affairs of the 6 palaces. How about that?" Du Qinghuan froze, her heart sinking to the depths of despair. She understood then that Lu Xian did not want her brother's life. He wanted her empress seal. So she bowed deeply, her voice as calm as the drizzle in a desolate plain, a sound that made Lu Xian's heart faintly tremble. "This concubine thanks your majesty for your grace." Afterward, her illness worsened. Her mother, Lady Sun, was deeply worried and often requested to visit her in the palace. Seeing Du Qinghuan's pallor, Lady Sun wept with sorrow. "The emperor is so heartless. He deserves to be devoured by 100 corpse worms." Du Qinghuan was horrified and began coughing violently. "Mother, such disrespectful words must never be spoken again." Realizing her mistake, Lady Sun quickly restrained her anger and earnestly advised Du Qinghuan to recover quickly and, most importantly, to conceive a child. The entire new year was spent in bitter cold. Even when the emperor performed the sacrificial rites, Du Qinghuan was too ill to leave her bed and had no choice but to let noble consort Zhao take over. In this situation, even the children in the counties knew that the Zhao family had risen to power. When spring arrived, Chancellor Du, at Du Qinghuan's request, summoned a famous doctor from the Jianghu to the capital, who was finally able to bring her illness under control. This man was an old friend from her childhood days when she had been convalescing in the south. He was highly skilled in poison, insects, and medicine. As the evening breeze carried a shower of crabapple petals, Du Qinghuan stood in the soft twilight, turning to the young doctor in white robes and said, "I called you to the capital from so far away because I have something to ask of you." She smiled faintly, a touch of desolate resolve in her brows. "I want you to make me a potion." It was already past the hour of Su when Lu Xian finished reviewing the memorials. Today was the 15th, the day when the emperor and empress were supposed to share their bed. Rubbing his tired temples, he ordered his attendants to take him to Cunning Palace. The light clouds veiled the moon, and a thin mist hung like gauze in the air. In the distance, the palace he was about to enter was brightly lit, and as he approached, the rich aroma of wine wafted towards him. Looking up, he saw a beauty standing gracefully under the crabapple tree, waiting for him with a gentle demeanor. Lu Xian noticed that Du Qinghuan had dressed up meticulously tonight. She wore light makeup, and her hair was adorned with a delicate flower ornament. Her lake green palace dress accentuated her graceful figure like a willow in the wind. Gone was her usual calm composure. Tonight, her eyes sparkled with a captivating allure. Lu Xian's heart skipped a beat when he saw that a table of exquisite dishes and fine wine had been set up behind her. "Your Majesty must be weary from your duties. How about some supper?" Du Qinghuan smiled shyly, her natural allure evident in her every gesture. "Come to think of it, I've never had the pleasure of sharing a drink with you." It was the first time Du Qinghuan had ever invited him. Raising an eyebrow in curiosity, Lu Xian wondered what she was planning, but he agreed. The two of them sat at the stone table beneath the tree, and Du Qinghuan poured wine for him, cup after cup, while they chatted idly. Lu Xian realized that they had been married for 7 years, yet never before had they sat together so calmly, talking about the beautiful landscapes of the world and reminiscing about the mischievous days of their youth. Caught up in the moment, Lu Xian suddenly asked her, "Before you were married, did you have any unfulfilled wishes?" "I've always wanted to watch the sunrise from a mountaintop." The March night was cool, and perhaps it was the wine, or perhaps it was the enchantment of the beauty before him, but Lu Xian's eyes took on a soft sheen. In a good mood, he replied, "If time permits, I'll take you there someday." Even though she knew his vague words were likely an empty promise, Du Qinghuan couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness. She looked up into his eyes, her smile dazzling. "Do you really mean it?" A ruler does not lie." The palace attendants had all retreated to the courtyard, leaving the night shrouded in a soft haze, the world momentarily silent except for the sound of their shallow breaths. Du Qinghuan clutched the hem of her robe, biting her lip lightly as she asked, "Your Majesty, could you kiss me?" Lu Xian said nothing, gazing at her in silence for a long while before suddenly laughing, a mix of self-mockery and indulgence in his voice. "So, all the effort you put into tonight was just to get me drunk for this moment?" With that, he scooped her up in his arms without hesitation and strode into the hall. As his lips met hers, he whispered against her mouth, "As you wish." Perhaps it had been too long since they had been intimate, for both of them acted strangely tonight. Lu Xian was uncharacteristically gentle, and Du Qinghuan was uncharacteristically bold, even daring to bite his lip until it bled, the taste of blood mingling in their mouths as they kissed. In the middle of the night, a fierce wind suddenly howled, and a torrential rain pounded down. The cold night wind seeped through the cracks in the windows, disrupting the atmosphere in the room. Occasionally, a flash of lightning would illuminate the dark, thick night. Lu Xian stared at the sleeping Du Qinghuan in his arms, her temples damp with fragrant sweat, and let out a long sigh, both restrained and satisfied. Lu Xian actually harbored many secrets that Du Qinghuan knew nothing about, yet all of them were related to her. If one were to turn back the pages of time to 7 years ago, Du Qinghuan had believed that Lu Xian was enamored with Zhuang Yingxue. But in reality, he had only drawn close to her to win over Minister Zhuang. Lu Xian knew very well that the father and daughter were blinded by greed. When he fell from grace, Zhuang Yingxue quickly married Lu Yi to distance herself from him. Lu Xian had always been vengeful, so he pretended to be infatuated with Zhuang Yingxue to provoke Chancellor Du and have him eliminate them. Soon enough, Minister Zhuang and Lu Yi were both brought down, and Zhuang Yingxue met her untimely end. That night, Lu Xian sat alone in the courtyard, drinking. He felt neither joy nor sorrow, just an inexplicable irritation, because of Du Qinghuan. Earlier, when he had deliberately kept things ambiguous with Zhuang Yingxue, Du Qinghuan had remained completely unperturbed, much to Lu Xian's annoyance. He wanted to shatter her calm composure, to see her lose her temper and rage, but Du Qinghuan remained gentle and obedient, impervious to his provocations. She was like a serene moon, high and aloof, unfazed by worldly matters. No matter how he indulged in pleasures or threw tantrums, she always accepted it all with a calm and patient demeanor. This infuriated Lu Xian, making him feel like a petty clown throwing a childish tantrum before her. Yet, time is the best remedy. As the stars shifted and time passed, Lu Xian didn't know when it began, but he started to notice Du Qinghuan's beauty. The way she reclined against the crabapple tree with a book in her hand, the way she lowered her gaze while arranging his court robes, the fragrant breeze that followed her wide sleeves, and the breathtaking grace when she turned to look back, all of it was stunningly beautiful. Later, the late emperor issued an edict, commanding Lu Xian to lead his troops northward, where he encountered Zhao Wan, a woman as fierce and captivating as a fiery rose. The two quickly bonded, sharing deep conversations, and Lu Xian believed, for a time, that she was his destined partner. Yet, every time his life hung by a thread, it was Du Qinghuan who filled his thoughts. Always Du Qinghuan. During one particularly fierce battle, Lu Xian was caught between enemy forces, his body battered and bruised. The enemy general struck a powerful blow, cleaving through his chest armor, causing blood to spill profusely. As Lu Xian looked down, he noticed a flash of red peeking through the torn inner lining of his armor. Reaching inside, he pulled out a small, delicate talisman for protection. He recalled the image of Du Qinghuan under the lamp, stitching the talisman into his clothing, the soft light casting a warm glow on her gentle profile. Suddenly, his chest warmed with a surge of emotion, filling him with renewed fighting spirit. Despite being on the brink of collapse, he managed to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Lu Xian realized that something was wrong with him, so much so that after returning victorious to the capital, he dared not go near Du Qinghuan. He repeatedly reminded himself that it was Zhao Wan he loved, that Zhao Wan was the one most suited to him, and that he must never forget that a watchful and ambitious chancellor stood behind Du Qinghuan. He took Zhao Wan horseback riding through flower-filled fields, returning only at dusk. That day, as expected, a torrential downpour began. Soaked to the skin, Lu Xian returned to his chambers to find a cup of warm ginger tea waiting for him, steam rising gently from it. The sight unexpectedly brought a sense of comfort to his wearied heart. Later, When Lucien ascended to the throne and became emperor, the political situation forced him to quickly establish a loyal faction. His first choice was the Zhao family, which stood behind Zhao Wan. He neglected the empress and favored his concubine, all in an attempt to force Du Qinghuan to relinquish the empress's seal. He even schemed to bring down her brother. But when Du Qinghuan, frail and sickly, knelt before him, Lucien found himself unable to remain calm. He instinctively pulled Zhao Wan into his arms, feigning affection. He didn't dare to look up at her, fearing that he might feel a pang of regret and heartache. No one knew that the days Lucien most looked forward to were the 15th of each month. Only on this day did he have a legitimate excuse to go to her palace, feeling justified and at ease. Lucien began to despise himself, hating that even though he knew she might be coveting his throne, he couldn't resist the urge to drag her down with him, to entangle her in his turmoil. That year, during the Qiqiao festival, Lucien was in the imperial study discussing state affairs with his ministers, and by the time they dispersed, he was utterly exhausted. Zhao Wan, however, approached him with a displeased expression, chiding him for missing the time to release river lanterns and insisting he join her in playful activities. At first, Lucien had favored Zhao Wan's fiery temperament, but as time passed, he found her increasingly spoiled and willful. Moreover, the Zhao family had grown powerful and arrogant, lacking the composure and restraint of the Du family. Angered, Lucien harshly rebuked Zhao Wan and sent her away, his mind racing with thoughts that solidified his decision to abandon this pawn. Under the clear moonlight and gentle breeze, he dismissed his attendants and wandered alone through the splendid palace halls, eventually finding himself by the Yujing River. 1,000 lotus lanterns floated along the water, their lights reflecting beautifully. As he walked, he suddenly heard a woman's voice. "My lady, quickly make a wish to be with His Majesty forever." Lucien looked closer and saw Du Qinghuan by the riverside, dressed in a light green gown, holding a delicate lotus lantern. Hearing her maid's words, she shook her head with a faint, sorrowful smile. "No, I only wish for a life without too many entanglements, so that when I cross the bridge of helplessness in the afterlife, I can smoothly untangle the threads of fate. In the next life, don't let him meet me again." What Du Qinghuan was thinking was that since Lucien did not favor her and had grown tired of her, she wished for him to find true happiness in his next life, free from any constraints. But to Lucien, these words sounded like a muffled thunder in the depths of the sea, unleashing a storm within him that left him cold and shivering to his core. She truly didn't like him. She didn't even want any ties to him in this life, let alone the next. If Du Xiang had not forced her to marry him as a pawn, she probably wouldn't have even spared him a second glance. Lucien felt as if his blood was no longer flowing, his heart twisting with uncontrollable pain. He fled the scene in panic, avoiding Du Qinghuan for the next half-month. As August drew to an end, the scorching sun baked the earth, and when news of the Empress's pregnancy spread, the palace seemed to boil over like a pot of hot oil. The imperial physician, trembling with fear, knelt before Lucien, daring to advise him, "Your Majesty, this child cannot be allowed to survive." Lucien closed his eyes tightly. "I know. The medicine you ordered is ready. Shall we proceed as planned?" Lucien clenched his fists, a heavy weight pressing on his heart, making even breathing difficult. After a long silence, he finally uttered in a hollow voice, "Wait a little longer." On the Double Ninth Festival, Emperor Jiyuan led the concubines to offer ancestral sacrifices. After drinking chrysanthemum wine and offering incense, they exited the ancestral hall. As they descended the high steps of the hall, Du Qinghuan, who was walking beside Lucien, suddenly stumbled and fell down the jade steps. Lucien was startled and reached out to catch her, but only managed to graze the hem of her sleeve. Du Qinghuan lay on the ground, her face pale with pain. Her maid hurriedly lifted her up and, glaring at Zhao Wan, accused, "Your Grace, why did you step on my lady's gown?" According to rank, Zhao Wan had indeed been walking behind Du Qinghuan. Seeing that Du Qinghuan's lower body was quickly stained with blood, Zhao Wan sneered inwardly. With her current favor, how could Lu Xian believe the clumsy accusation of an empress with no influence? This was the thought in everyone's mind, but to their surprise, Lu Xian suddenly erupted in fury, slapping Zhao Wan across the face and shouting, "Vile, poisonous woman." The slap stunned not only the concubines, but also the entire court. After years of political maneuvering, the Du and Zhao families had become bitter rivals. Now, with this opportunity, Du Xiong ruthlessly suppressed the Zhao family. Pushed to the brink, General Zhao lashed out, exposing many of Du Xiong's schemes. In this struggle between the snipe and the clam, it was Lu Xian who ultimately reaped the benefits, having successfully thrown the court into chaos. Du Qinghuan's child could not be saved, not because of the fall, but because the chrysanthemum wine she had drunk earlier had been laced with safflower. Lu Xian flew into a rage. He had indeed intended to drug the wine, having planted ironclad evidence in Zhao Wan's palace, but in the end, he had softened and abandoned the plan. Yet, despite this, the innocent life was still lost. The imperial physicians and staff prostrated themselves on the floor, enduring the emperor's wrath. It wasn't until late at night that Du Qinghuan's maid emerged from the inner chamber, knelt behind Lu Xian, and confessed, "Your Majesty, this was all the Empress's wish." Lu Xian trembled. The safflower powder had been hidden in Du Qinghuan's nails. She knew that Lu Xian would never allow the Du family's bloodline to survive and had guessed his intention to use her unborn child to weaken the Zhao family, so she had fulfilled his wish. Though confined to the inner palace, Du Qinghuan had more or less guessed Lu Xian's plans. The Du and Zhao families were in a delicate balance of power. If one fell, the other would soon follow. At this moment, the maid kowtowed deeply, pleading, "Your Majesty, the Empress's only request is that you spare the lives of the Du clan." The cool night breeze swept past the palace eaves, ruffling his hair. Lu Xian stood silently outside the hall for a long time, until the mist dampened his brows, and only then did he let out a bitter laugh. She truly had no feelings for him. That was the only reason she could so ruthlessly kill their child, using it as a bargaining chip to win his favor. The two major factions entrenched in the court had reached their limits after tearing each other apart. Du Qinghuan, recovering from a miscarriage, had just begun to see some improvement after months of recuperation. However, on the very night she seemed to be getting better, she suddenly developed a high fever, her body racked with pain, cold sweat pouring from her, and her blood vessels seeming to wriggle like worms beneath her skin. The court physician diagnosed her with the 100-corpse goo poison. Lu Xian was shocked, suspecting Zhao Wan to be the culprit. He was about to rush to the cold palace to seek justice when he was informed that his father-in-law wanted to see him. By now, Du's father was no longer the prime minister, but had been demoted and exiled. Lu Xian, sensing the reason for the visit, ordered his arrival immediately. Seeing Emperor Jiyuan unharmed, Du's father was astonished and tentatively asked, "Your Majesty, do you feel unwell?" Just this one question made Lu Xian instantly understand the situation. He kicked Du's father in the chest, shouting, "You scoundrel!" Although Lu Xian had successfully removed his political rivals, he always felt that Du's father had left a hidden trap. It turned out that many years ago, when Du's father chose Lu Xian as his son-in-law, he had secretly poisoned him with the 100-corpse goo. This poison has a very long incubation period and only activates if the mother goo is provoked. Du's father had planned to use the goo poison to kill Lu Xian after Du Qinghuan gave birth to the emperor's child, but he underestimated the current emperor's capabilities. Now cornered, he was forced to use the mother goo to threaten Lu Xian for wealth and power. However, Du's father did not expect that Du Qinghuan had already transferred the poison to himself. That year, when she had a relapse of her cold, her mother accidentally revealed the secret while visiting her in the palace. As astute as Du Qinghuan was, she immediately realized something was wrong. Thus, she went to great lengths to call back an old friend who was a renowned doctor. The 100-corpse goo could not be eradicated, and the only way to deal with it was to transfer it to another person. Du Qinghuan asked her old friend to prepare a drug to be mixed in wine and invited Lu Xian to drink with her. During a kiss, she bit both their lips, allowing the goo to transfer through the blood. Lu Xian initially thought that Du's father would show compassion and stop using the mother goo. To his dismay, upon learning of Du Qinghuan's actions, Du's father angrily denounced her as a rebellious daughter and wished for her death. Lu Xian had no choice but to summon doctors from across the land. By the time the goo poison was removed from Du Qinghuan's body, she had endured 9 days of torment. Du Qinghuan lay on the bed, on the brink of death, as Lu Xian held her withered hand against his cheek. He whispered, "Didn't you say you wanted to watch the sunrise from the mountaintop? If you survive, I will take you to see the sea of clouds and the morning sun." His heart ached with each beat, and a faint glimmer of hope, though dim, was enough to bring him lifelong joy. Lu Xian wanted to ask Du Qinghuan why she was willing to transfer the poison, and he wanted to know if he had a place in her heart. Unfortunately, she did not give him this opportunity. Du Qinghuan survived but was no longer the beautiful woman she once was. Her once smooth skin was now ravaged by the goo, unrecognizable and horrifying to all who saw it. The city's most beautiful woman had lost all her former grace. For the first time in her life, the usually compliant Du Qinghuan boldly refused to let the emperor in, no matter what. "Your Majesty, I am too unworthy and fear I might offend your Majesty's dignity." Lu Xian could hear the pleading tone in her voice, despite her efforts to remain calm. His heart ached as he softly coaxed, "I don't care. But I do." She took a deep breath. "Your Majesty need not feel guilty. You must have forgotten that you once saved my life when I was young. Now, let me repay you." This time, she referred to herself as Qinghuan, the Qinghuan of the Du family, once renowned in the capital, no longer his concubine. Her whispered words from that day she released the river lantern seemed to echo in his ears. "I only wish for fewer entanglements in the remaining years of my life, and in the next life, we need not meet again." Lu Xian understood that there was no longer any possibility between them, even if she had feelings for him. The wounds had become a chronic condition, and some hearts, like deep abysses, could no longer bridge the gap between souls. Later, Lu Xian indeed never set foot in the Kuan-Ning Palace again. Though they were both in the imperial city, only a few miles apart, they had no further interactions. It wasn't until the completion of the Hongxing Temple in Luoyang that Du Qinghuan sent a maid to inform Lu Xian that she wished to go to offer prayers for the Great Qin. Lu Xian agreed. On the day she left the capital, the winter wind was biting and the snow fell thickly, just as it had many years ago. Lu Xian stood on the city tower, watching her from a distance as she wore a light cloak embroidered with camellias and a thick veil, her figure so frail. Then she lifted the curtain and entered the carriage, blocking his view and all his lingering feelings. Years have passed, and it has been 11 springs and autumns. Almost everyone in the palace has forgotten the existence of Empress Du. Sometimes, even Lu Xian himself nearly forgets. But no matter how lively the surroundings are, there is always a place in his heart that remains unfilled. This desolate emptiness lingers, haunting him every quiet, deep night. One day, a favored concubine, acting on her own accord, discarded the old amulet that Lu Xian kept under his pillow day and night. This act angered him greatly, leading him to strip her of her title and cast her into the cold palace. Everyone was astonished and confused. They only remembered that day when the usually steady Emperor Ji Yuan was visibly flustered, ordering the palace servants to retrieve the amulet with urgency. Lu Xian closed his eyes tightly, realizing that the passage of time had not diminished his obsession or sorrow by even a fraction. "Qinghuan, how long has it been, and why does her image still not enter his dreams?" Over the years, Du Qinghuan had been residing at Hongxing Temple, devotedly chanting scriptures and eating a simple diet, sincerely praying for blessings. Lu Xian sent large amounts of beauty-preserving medicinal herbs every month, which gradually improved her damaged skin, restoring her to the former beauty of the capital's most renowned woman. Yet, Du Qinghuan's health continued to deteriorate. The goo had not only damaged her skin but also her meridians and internal organs, with internal injuries being the hardest to heal. In her final years, she often suffered from dizziness and weakness, struggled with the weight of her illness, and had become increasingly frail and bedridden. Du Qinghwan understood that she was nearing her limit. She suddenly thought that if reincarnation truly existed in her next life, she wanted to be a gentle breeze traveling through the 4 seasons. That way, she could softly caress his hair and freely embrace him. As winter approached, Du Qinghwan suffered from a persistent high fever and severe coughing up of blood. The doctors who came to examine her could only shake their heads and sigh, unable to offer any hope. One night, while she was deeply asleep, she seemed to sense a familiar warmth covering her hand. Du Qinghwan slowly opened her beautiful eyes to see Lu Xian beside her. Her eyes brightened with joy, and her complexion improved noticeably. Lu Xian's heart ached, realizing that this was just a fleeting moment of light before the end. Through the years of separation, carrying his lingering longing, he gently stroked her cheek and said softly, "I once promised to take you to the mountaintop to see the sunrise." The long night had not yet dawned, the mountain shrouded in mist, and the sky was covered in a deep indigo hue. Hongxing Temple was located halfway up the mountain, and Lu Xian carried Du Qinghwan on his back, step by step, up the stone steps leading to the summit. Along the way, they talked about many things, those unspoken or unmentionable, all concerns set aside at this moment. Du Qinghwan rested her head on his shoulder and softly said, "Your Majesty, I am very happy to have spent over 10 years with you. Just, in the next life, don't encounter me again." Hearing this, Lu Xian's eyes filled with tears. She wished for him to find his true love in the next life, but he did not know that in his next life, he most wanted to meet her again. The person on his back gradually lost their warmth until it was completely gone. Lu Xian hesitated in his steps, struggling to endure the pain in his heart, and carried her to the peak. The next moment, the morning sun pierced through the clouds, bathing the earth in warm golden light, and the morning sky was breathtakingly beautiful. Yet, this scene was one Du Qinghwan would never see, having spent her entire life without the chance to witness it. Holding her increasingly cold body, Lu Xian suddenly recalled the first time he saw her, on a snowy winter day. Du Qinghwan stood in the vastness of the world, holding a sky-blue oil paper umbrella amidst the swirling snow, resembling a blooming camellia. Lu Xian looked up into her clear eyes, and in that moment, it felt as if he saw the only source of light in the world.